On this edition of the Correspondence, former FBI Director James Comey makes a highly anticipated appearance at a U.S. Senate hearing on the Russian intrusion into the 2016 presidential campaign. British voters deliver a stunning rebuke in a snap election called by Prime Minister Theresa May, aimed at bolstering her mandate to negotiate Britain's exit from the European Union. And the health of the world's oceans is the overriding concern as thousands gather in New York to demand action to save the planet. Hello, I'm Millar Sega, and this is the Correspondence on Voice of America. Well, Washington was abuzz this week after former FBI Director James Comey accused the White House of lying about his dismissal and accused Donald Trump of pressuring him to carry out the president's wishes. But while Comey confirmed that Trump himself was not a target of the FBI's Russia investigation, he declined to say whether the president's actions amounted to possible obstruction of justice. VOA's Michael Bowman has our report.
While a nation held its breath and onlookers swarmed to Capitol Hill, James Comey broke his silence 1 month after President Trump fired him as FBI director and White House officials accused him of leaving the FBI in disarray.
Those were lies, plain and simple. And I am so sorry that the FBI workforce had to hear them, and I'm so sorry that the American people were told them.
Comey detailed a series of one-on-one meetings and telephone calls he says Trump orchestrated.
I was so stunned by the conversation because it was very, very awkward. He was asking for something and I was refusing to give it.
Specifically, Comey said, the president wanted an end to the FBI's probe of former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who lied about contacts with Russia's ambassador.
I took it as a direction. Right. I mean, this is the President of the United States, with me alone, saying, I hope this.
And Comey said Trump pressed him to publicly affirm that he personally was not under investigation. The exchanges led Comey to undertake something he had not done with previous presidents, write memos about his dealings with Trump.
And joining us now for the fallout, if any, from James Comey's testimony, we are joined from our rooftop by VOA national correspondent Jim Malone, who probably has the best view of the Capitol today here in Washington. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks, Mil.
And right here in Studio 52, our very own VOA White House Bureau Chief Steve Herman, who's had another busy week covering the president. I thank you both for joining us. Jim Malone, very interesting to note that yesterday streets were very quiet here in D.C. Bars were open early. Did Comey's testimony actually live up to the hype?
In some ways, yes. Maybe in other ways, no. You know, my big takeaway here, I think, in a long-term political impact, you had a high-ranking former FBI official tell Congress that he decided to take careful notes and for memos about his conversations with the President of the United States because he feared the President would be lying about some of their interactions. These are extraordinary revelations coming out of this hearing. And on that score, I think it goes to this issue of credibility, the president's credibility, and also what you noticed yesterday is during the Comey testimony, the Republicans, although they were trying to defend the president, they weren't doing much challenging of what Comey had to say in his testimony.
Steve Herman, to Jim Malone's point, does this hurt the president's credibility? What was your takeaway from this hearing?
I think this was damaging. There's no doubt about it. The key question is it short-term damage, or does it lead to something that is eventually going to be fatal for this administration? And it's really too early to know that right now.
The headline that I thought was stunning for me was the fact that the former head of the FBI actually called the White House, therefore the president, a liar. Lying is not something used very loosely here in Washington. What do you make of that charge?
Well, as Jim said, extraordinary testimony, very blunt, very direct, definitely targeted at the president. Over at the White House, though, the talking points is that Comey is a liar and Comey is a leaker. And the president tweeting on Friday morning that as a result of this testimony, he's been vindicated. So a very different perception of this within the West Wing.
Jim Malone, I'm wondering if you can speak to the president's allegations that this is pure vindication for him, that he actually won. Can the president actually call this vindication when he's been called a liar and he's possibly the subject now of an investigation into obstruction of justice?
It may be a stretch, and I think if you asked Republicans in Congress, they might not be willing to completely back that up quite yet. You know, one of the central issues here is his reported conversation with Trump over Michael Flynn and his assertion that he felt it was a directive from the president to end the Flynn investigation. The president's lawyer says that did not happen. The question is, was that enough right there to present the idea of obstruction of justice, which is a criminal term? Right now it's debatable, but it may be the start of something there and may add to the investigation, and that would be a problem for the president.
Steve, for someone who prides himself in being a really good counterpuncher, the president showed some remarkable discipline yesterday, not even making one single tweet during the entire hearing. But the White House has responded. What is the White House saying now?
Well, Sarah Huckabee Sanders came out to brief reporters while Comey was still testifying midday Thursday, and was saying it was just a regular Thursday at the White House. And there were questions asked about whether there's a taping system, because that was referred to in Comey's testimony as well. Comey said, if there are tapes, I hope they're released, because he feels that will verify what he was saying in his conversations at the dinner with the president. And Sanders was pressed about that, the chief deputy spokesperson, and she said, jokingly, well, maybe she'll look under the sofas to see if there are any recording devices. So they haven't answered the question about whether there is some sort of taping system in the White House. Right. And that, again, is another thing that harkens back to the Nixon era and Watergate.
And Jim Malone, I suspect that question is going to be raised probably as early as next week by some lawmakers, the fact that was there or was there not a recording. In fact, Jim Comey said, Lordy, I hope there is a recording. What do you think is going to take place here?
Yeah, right now it's Comey's word against the president's. But, here's the other thing, I think, in a bottom line sense, Mill. Even if there is some intimation of law breaking, what does that mean? Under our system, it's not clear if the president can be charged with a crime. Under the Constitution, generally what happens here is if the president is suspected of what's called high crimes and misdemeanors, it's referred to the building over my shoulder, the Congress, for impeachment proceedings. Well, who controls Congress right now? Both houses are controlled by Republicans. And based on yesterday, I'm not seeing any clear breaks with Republicans on the president where it could lead that way. Democrats themselves cannot present impeachment articles. So for the moment, I think Republicans may think there's been no bombshell here, but I think clearly they're uneasy about where this is all going because the Mueller probe will continue indefinitely.
Steve, speak to me about the unease among Republican lawmakers. I mean, the kind of support we've seen is rather tepid at best. I think Paul Ryan did try to defend the president.
Well, on the Senate side, you have several senators who are openly skeptical of what the president has done and what he's doing, and there are a number of other senators on the GOP side that certainly feel that way as well. But the key is really the Republicans in the House of Representatives. And no one dares speak out unless they want to lose their seat, because the president's threatened to support opponents against them in primary Republican elections. Right. And so, as Jim pointed out, with that sort of control of both houses of Congress, unless there's some sort of mass defection by House Republicans that feel that it's better to run away from the president than stick by his side, we're not going to really see any movement towards an impeachment in the Congress.
Jim Malone, what would it take for Republican lawmakers to start peeling off their support for the president? Because as Steve and you have mentioned, support from the Republican base remains fairly solid at this stage.
Well, it's interesting to note the polls show the president's approval rating is dropping to pretty low levels, but his core base of supporters appear to be hanging with him. That's really what Republican lawmakers are watching, and it's actually a risk for them to abandon the president and then risk the ire of those Trump voters who they rely on to get elected. So the dynamics here would have to change considerably. But as I say, it's a clear, beautiful day here in Washington. You can't see the cloud of the Russia investigation behind me, but I can assure you it's there, and it's going to remain there for some time to come. And
last word, I hear that cloud is getting darker and darker.
Well, it all depends on what media you're watching, because if you watch the conservative media, Fox News, then you think everything is hunky-dory with the presidency. And if you watch some of the other channels, MSNBC, CNN, you think that we're perhaps weeks away from the end of this presidency, and the reality is obviously somewhere in the middle.
Well, I suspect we will be following this story fairly closely. Steve Herman and Jim Malone, thank you very much. We're going to take a short break right now, but when we come back, the latest on the snap election this week in the United Kingdom, some calling the results a shocker. This is The Correspondents on Voice of America.
This is Living Better.
A yoga class in Kigali, Rwanda. The class is a source of therapy for these women, some still traumatized by genocide or suffering from HIV. With yoga, they can relax body and mind, and it was introduced here in 2007 by an NGO called Project AIR, founded by Deirdre Somerville.
A body that was once a prison becomes a sanctuary. It's a huge change. It's the difference between life and death.
Participants include genocide survivors, orphans, former prostitutes, and HIV patients like Marianne Mukungera. There are times when I would be asleep and hear good voices from our instructors, she says, and it's like being away from the earth and feeling good. Wellness experts increasingly acknowledge the quality of yoga as an alternative therapy for those suffering from post-traumatic stress and other difficult situations. I'm Martin Seacrest for VOA's Living Better.
And welcome back to The Correspondents. I'm Mil Arcega here in Washington. Well, Britain held a snap election this week, 3 years ahead of schedule. The early election was called by Prime Minister Theresa May with the aim of winning strong backing for her government during the upcoming negotiations in Brussels on the country's exit from the European Union. But that's not exactly how it turned out. Here's Prime Minister May speaking to Parliament about why this election was so important.
I believe it is in Britain's national interest to hold an election now. A general election is the best way to strengthen Britain's hand in the negotiations ahead, because securing the right deal for Britain is my priority, and I'm confident that we have the plan to do it.
So all 650 seats in the House of Commons, the lower house of Parliament, were up for election Thursday. The party needs to win 326 seats to form a majority government. The terror attacks in London and Manchester obviously overshadowed the late stages of political campaigning. Some of the campaigning was actually suspended. And obviously May's calculations appear to have backfired in spectacular fashion. So for the latest now, as we go to air on the outcome of this British election, we are joined from our London studio by VOA European correspondent Henry Ridgwell. It's been a busy, long night for you. Can't wait to talk to you. And once again, obviously, by VOA White House Bureau Chief Steve Herman for the geopolitical side of all this. My thanks to both of you. Henry, so I'm assuming that most of the ballots are in now, but it seems Theresa May made a huge gamble and is probably very sorry that she did. What can you tell us? What's the latest from there?
A huge gamble, which, as you saw in that clip of her in the House of Commons, saying that Britain needed some form of stability to take forward into the Brexit negotiations. Well, they've got completely the opposite now. They've got a period of distinct instability as her government tries to work out a way in which it can retain some kind of power, some kind of stability to take forward. And the only way it seems that she can do that at the moment is to work with one of the other small parties, the Democratic Unionist Party, a party from Northern Ireland, which had been sharing power there. They are also pro-Brexit. They want Britain to leave the European Union, so there is common ground between the two parties. They currently hold now 10 seats in Parliament. So even still, the government's working majority would be wafer thin. And in fact, Theresa May would just rely on the Democratic Unionist Party on an ad hoc basis, vote by vote. So it would be very difficult for her to push through the kind of legislation, the kind of changes to Britain that we're going to see over the next 2 years as Brexit negotiations take place.
So Henry, we're likely to see a lot of backroom dealing here. I mean, May started out with 330 seats, which was barely a majority. Can she still lead the country without a majority? What actually happens next? What does she have to do to become the next the prime minister?
Well, in what to many viewers will probably seem a piece of archaic British arrangement, she has to basically persuade the Queen, the monarch, that she can form a stable government. She's already visited the Queen this morning to request permission to do that. And I think over the weekend, over the next 2 or 3 days, talks are going to take place between her and the Democratic Unionist Party, who, as I said, have these 10 seats, to see if they can come to an arrangement and make things work. In reality, most analysts think her days are numbered. Most of her party don't want to rock the boat again. This is a devastating blow for the Conservative Party, but they just want a period of stability now to take a breath, calm down, get those Brexit negotiations started, and perhaps in a few months' time in the summer, or perhaps in October after the German elections, which is a completely other story, Britain will look to, or the Conservative Party will look to choose a new leader, and we may go through this all over again. We may be forced to have another general election as another new leader seeks to get a mandate for his or her own vision of Brexit. So we went from, her catchphrase was strong and stable. We've got exactly the opposite. We've got absolute chaos.
Steve Herman, I'm wondering, how does this affect the United States? I mean, Theresa May came to this country a few months ago promising to be a strong ally to Donald Trump. Has Donald Trump lost an ally here?
I think this is not good for the Trump administration. He had the best relationship with May compared to the leaders of the other key European countries. You've got Macron in France and Merkel, as Henry mentioned, up for re-election. It's prudent for her to not be seen as getting too cozy with Trump for domestic political purposes. I was on the trip with the president when he went to NATO and the G7 summit in Sicily. And I wouldn't quite say that it was obvious that relations were frosty with all of those other leaders, but they weren't overly warm. And there's definitely a perception that the United States has stepped aside from its role as the global leader, and leadership is people in the rest of the world are looking in a different direction, looking to the Germans, which is remarkable. And Macron has been very involved in the diplomacy in recent days with this rising crisis in the Middle East, with Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is usually something we would be seeing shuttle diplomacy from the United States. So there is a strong sense, Steve, among Europeans that we have to go it alone, forget about the United States. They're sort of left in their own world. I'm wondering how this election reverberates around the rest of Europe. As you mentioned, Germany is about to have its own election this fall. This is a continuation of an earthquake, the echoes from the earthquake that we've seen with the Brexit vote, with Duterte in the Philippines, with Trump here in the United States, the election of an outsider who didn't even really have a political party in France. And we are in a global period of political upheaval, for good or for bad, and politicians around the world and those of us in the media need to recognize that things are shifting very quickly. Political upheaval and an awful lot of uncertainty. Henry, how does Theresa May's weak showing affect Brexit negotiations that are set to begin in just a matter of days?
Well, it depends who you talk to. If you ask on the British side, there are those who did not want to leave the European Union, whose hopes have been stoked today that actually there won't be what's called a hard Brexit, which essentially means leaving every single institution to do with Europe, whether it be the single market, the customs union, all of those benefits that they see that Britain has got from the European Union. On the other hand, if you speak to officials in Brussels, they say, well, we don't care the makeup of the government in Britain. You've already told us you're leaving. The clock is ticking. That clock runs out on March the 30th, 2019. And already Britain has lost 2 months of negotiating time with this election. It seems to be losing more time potentially with this election result now. And the fear is, I think, that the result has increased what's known as a cliff edge scenario, in that the clock just runs out without a deal having been done. You can't extend those talks without unanimous approval from all other 27 EU member states. So on March the 30th, 2019, Britain could just fall out of the EU according to its rules, and nothing would be in place to replace it, which would be a disaster for Britain, and it would also hit the EU economy hard as well.
Okay, we're already seeing reverberations on the global economy. I know the British pound already lost a lot of money. I wish I had more time to discuss this with Henry Ridgewell and Steve Herman. I thank you both. We're going to take another break right now, but when we come back, we look at the state of the world's oceans, which was the focus of a meeting at the United Nations this week. We'll have more on that in just a moment, but first, a reminder. We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, and comments on our Facebook page. The address is VOA The Correspondents. We'll be right back.
This is BizBeat.
People from around the world have enjoyed the unique hand-carved sandwiches at Manhattan's Katz Deli for over 100 years. And during World War II, the New York delicatessen began shipping food and salami to young men in the Army. Today, the renowned deli, always filled with thick, stacked sandwich eaters, wants to try shipping their famous meats around the globe. Owner Jake Dell.
I think one of the biggest challenges is keeping the taste the same as it goes in transit.
The company still sends meats around the country, but figuring out a global distribution plan is still in the testing phase. Customers like Yaakov Sabag, who lives in Israel, thinks it's a good idea.
It's far away to mail some food to Israel, but if it comes to Israel and we have a station in Israel, yes, definitely.
Refrigeration for long-haul deliveries can be a challenge, but Dell says Canada is likely the first global stop, while South America has a strong passion for cured meats. From VOA's BizBeat, I'm Philip Alexio.
How do you see the world?
I see countries in turmoil.
I see our planet changing.
I see people at peace.
No matter how you see the world, you'll get an unbiased and uncensored view of it on Voice of America. On television, radio, online, and mobile. In more than 40 languages all day, every day. Millions of people tune us in.
How do I see the world? On Voice of America.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Milar Sega in Washington. More than 1 billion people around the world rely on food from the ocean as their primary source of protein. But that's changing as the planet's oceans become more polluted. This week, thousands of government, scientific, business, and civic leaders met in New York to mobilize and demand action to stop the decline of our planet's oceans. VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bashir has our report.
Pollution, plastics, overfishing. The world's oceans are getting increasingly unhealthy, and man has a lot to do with it.
The ocean is indeed trouble. It's not stuff that's been occurring naturally. All of these problems are created anthropogenically, and so it's for us to find the solutions to them.
Climate change is also making the ocean sick. As the planet warms, more carbon dioxide is emitted into the atmosphere, and the ocean absorbs it. This turns its waters more acidic, harming marine life, especially shellfish and coral reefs. Add in weather trends such as El Nino, and some marine life migrate elsewhere, taking the livelihoods of fishermen with them. 2/3 of the global tuna catch comes from the Pacific Islands. But in 2016, the fish followed warmer currents eastward, away from their traditional fishing grounds near Palau and Papua New Guinea. This also made the tuna vulnerable to illegal fishing and cost the islands more than $600 million in lost revenue.
And to explain the UN mandate to save the world's oceans, we are joined by VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bashir, who filed that report for us. You've been covering this event all week, Margaret, this week-long event in New York. So what was your takeaway? What was your sense of how bad the problem is for the world's oceans?
Well, the problem is bad, Mill, and we're killing the ocean. Basically, we're killing the ocean, and these are our weapons of choice. We have plastic cutlery, straws, plastic shopping bags, and beverage bottles. And these are really affecting the ocean and ruining the ecosystem of the ocean. And 8 million tons of plastics are going into the ocean each year. And guess what? The fish are ingesting them. And then we ingest the fish. So it's a bad cycle. So we had world leaders here this week. We had about 30 heads of state and government. We had ministers of environment and maritime affairs. We had business leaders, scientific leaders. It was really a very unprecedented gathering for the UN. And so the good news is, how are we going to fix the problem?
Yeah, how are we going to fix the problem?
Okay, so number one, prevention. Don't get your reusable, don't get your plastic grocery bags and your cutlery. Think twice about it. Use your reusable water bottle instead of a plastic one. We can all make small measures in our life to keep the plastic out of the ocean in the first place. And the second thing is, let the plastics producers be part of the solution. Let them help innovate eco-friendly packaging for items so that we won't have this amount of plastic going into the sea. And then today we're having more than 1,000 voluntary commitments. Everyone who's here is signing this great call to action, and it's a pledge to take action to protect marine environment, to protect the sea, to prevent pollution, to implement climate change measures, to mitigate the effects of climate change on the ocean. So there's a big call to action. But it's been a really interesting conference, and it's also really put the spotlight. I mean, I don't think I knew the problem was this bad a week ago. Right. And now I'm really going to think twice before I buy a bottle of water like this. We all can do our part.
Yeah, no, we all can do our part. And obviously governments can do a lot more as well collectively. But given what you said about climate change, how much of a worry was it that President Trump decided to pull the United States out of the Paris Accord? Is that a source of consternation among the delegates who attended this conference?
Sure, and they're upset about it, no doubt. But one of the ambassadors had a really good point. He said, look, the glass is still half full. Just because the United States pulled out doesn't mean it's half empty. Look at all the other countries who are still there, the rest of the world virtually. So just because one left doesn't mean that it's going to fall apart. So I think people are very focused on what they can do. They're also very encouraged that Americans as a people are supportive of the climate change agreement, and that local governments, state governments, and business are supporting it. So that's very important.
Obviously, there is a greater sense of urgency that something needs to be done. Is there any optimism at all among the delegates that something can and will be done about it? I mean, are they hopeful?
Yes, definitely. And things are already being done. That's the great part. Countries came here and said what they're doing. So, for instance, Indonesia, second biggest plastics polluter in the world. Gorgeous beaches in Bali. Well, they've realized it makes good economic sense to keep the ocean clean because the tourists aren't going to come to a filthy plastics and polluted beach. So they've already done legislation and such to improve the sea and to ban plastics and to cut back on it.
Margaret,
so countries are realizing it has a dual benefit.
Margaret, I thank you for raising awareness on this issue. It's a very important one, so thanks for that report. And thanks, obviously, to all our correspondents today. That is our show. But we hope you'll join us again next week for another edition of The Correspondents. In the meantime, stay up to date with the latest news at voanews.com. And please do check out our shows there. Just click on the Programs tab on the upper right of our homepage. We're also on Facebook and YouTube at VOA The Correspondents. Thanks for watching. I'm Bill Arcega. So long from Washington.